On a humid morning in Guatemala City in 1954, ordinary people woke up to rumors of tanks rolling at the border, foreign planes buzzing the sky, and a phantom army closing in. Radio sets crackled with confident messages from a rebel colonel promising liberation and order. Newspapers whispered about communists in the palace and Soviet conspiracies in the countryside. At the center of this gathering storm stood a democratically elected president, Jacobo Árbenz, who believed he could modernize his country, redistribute idle land, and pull Guatemala into the 20th century. Arrayed against him were some of the most powerful men in Washington and a private corporation with more influence than many small states. The operation to unseat him had a simple code name, PBSUCCESS. To understand how the CIA toppled Guatemala's democracy, we have to begin with bananas. In the early 20th century, the United Fruit Company, UFCO, was a behemoth with its own railroads, ports, and plantations stretching across Central America and the Caribbean. In Guatemala, UFCO controlled huge tracts of land, often uncultivated, plus a monopoly over transport and export facilities. Generations of workers labored for low wages, and the company paid minimal taxes secured by sweetheart concessions. This corporate kingdom was guarded by a familiar arrangement. Pliant governments protected UFCO's interests, and UFCO's interests helped keep those governments in place. By the 1940s, that status quo began to crack. A wave of reform swept Guatemala in the 1944 revolution, which ousted dictator Jorge Ubico and ushered in a short but remarkable democratic opening. People who had never voted before went to the polls. Unions organized. Newspapers proliferated. Public debate flourished. In 1950, a reserved but determined military officer, Jacobo Árbenz Guzman, won the presidency on a platform of modernization and national development. He wanted highways, a public port to break United Fruit's monopoly, and above all, land reform. Most Guatemalans were rural, and a small elite controlled most arable land. Árbenz believed economic stagnation and feudal labor relations kept his country poor and dependent. His solution was Decree 900, passed in 1952. It expropriated uncultivated land from large estates, compensated owners at the value they themselves had declared for tax purposes, and redistributed parcels to landless peasants. The reform explicitly protected small and medium farmers and targeted only idle acreage. But UFCO had vast unused holdings, and its declared tax valuations were strategically low to minimize taxes. When the government expropriated United Fruit's fallow land and offered compensation based on those own declarations, the company cried theft. United Fruit moved swiftly in the one arena it understood better than agriculture: public relations and high politics. It hired well-connected lobbyists, placed stories in American media warning of a communist beachhead forming in the Western Hemisphere, and emphasized alleged infiltration of Guatemala's government by Moscow. The timing was perfect. In Washington, the early 1950s were defined by the Cold War's hardening lines. Mao Zedong had taken China. The Korean War had scarred American memory. Senator Joseph McCarthy held hearings that smeared opponents as communist sympathizers. Inside the Eisenhower administration, several key officials had ties to United Fruit, or at least sympathy with its case. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, flinty and legalistic, saw the world as a struggle of absolutes. His brother, CIA Director Allen Dulles, ran covert operations from a quiet Georgetown house and believed clandestine action could shape history more effectively than speeches. From the administration's vantage point, Árbenz's reform looked like a threat. His government contained leftists, labor movements had grown. A small communist party operated legally and supported the reform coalition. Árbenz argued that Guatemala's communists were Guatemalan, not Soviet agents, and that his reforms were nationalist and democratic. But in the binary logic of 1954, nuance sounded like evasion. Inside the CIA, a plan began to take shape. It would be smaller than a conventional military campaign, yet designed to fracture political will. It would break the morale of the Guatemalan army, isolate the president from his support base, and present the illusion, then the reality, of an unstoppable rebellion. It would be cheap compared with war, deniable enough to keep the United States' fingerprints faint, and devastatingly effective if executed with discipline. Operation PBSUCCESS did not emerge from thin air. The CIA had been building a template for regime change since the late 1940s, propaganda to set the stage, cutouts to maintain plausible deniability, fronts to fund assets, and a blend of psychological operations with limited paramilitary force. In 1953, a parallel operation in Iran had overthrown Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh. Planners believed a similar mix of pressure, fear, and theatrics could unseat Árbenz. But Guatemala posed its own challenges. The Guatemalan army was small but professional. The president's mandate was fresh, his reforms popular among peasants, and the country's geography rugged. The answer was to go after perception. First, the CIA funded and nurtured an exile figure who could plausibly claim to lead a national liberation movement. They chose Colonel Carlos Castillo Armas, a Guatemalan officer with conservative credentials and a knack for making promises to many different patrons. He would front the rebellion, while CIA operatives supplied money, weapons, training sites in neighboring countries, and radio transmitters. The agency set up a radio station, La Voz de la Liberación, that broadcast from across the border but pretended to speak from deep inside Guatemala. It announced victories that hadn't happened yet, defections that hadn't occurred, and a swelling tide of support that didn't exist, until the tide began to appear real simply because enough people heard about it. Second, planners prepared a relentless psychological warfare campaign. Leaflets would rain over barracks warning that commanders had switched sides. Rumors would circulate that elite units were deserting. Letters and phone calls would reach officers' families predicting catastrophe if they remained loyal to Árbenz. Newspapers in the region would print articles about arms shipments from the Soviet bloc, stories that were sometimes the product of intelligence operations themselves. This fog of narrative would do what bombs alone could not. It would make the government's defenders wonder whether they still had a government to defend. Third, there would be action, just enough to convince wavering soldiers that resistance was futile, but not a full-scale invasion that might stiffen national resolve. Small columns of rebels would cross remote points on the border. Sabotage teams would disrupt rail lines or bridges. And crucially, aircraft would appear overhead, dropping small bombs and, more importantly, the sound of dominance. The CIA assembled a handful of older planes, P-47 Thunderbolts, C-47s, rigged to drop light explosives, and recruited pilots. The Air Force was tiny, but in the kind of operation Pisos envisioned, practical mattered more than volume. One decisive feature of the plan was to strike symbols. A fuel tank here, a military depot there, near misses over the capital, loud enough to rattle windows and nerves. Behind this plot lay a calculated bet about Guatemala's institutions. The Guatemalan army was conservative, hierarchical, and protective of its corporate identity. Many officers disliked Árbenz's alignment with radicalized unions and feared land reform would upend rural hierarchies in ways they couldn't control. Yet most were not eager to hand the country to mercenaries. The CIA didn't need to make them love Castillo Armas, it only needed to make them doubt Árbenz's staying power. If they believed the president was isolated and defeat inevitable, they would turn inward, seek guarantees, and ultimately ask the president to resign for the sake of order. The stage was set by a stroke of good, or, depending on your perspective, engineered timing. In late 1953 and early 1954, a shipment of arms for Guatemala became an international scandal. The government, rebuffed by American suppliers, purchased weapons from Eastern Europe and had them delivered on a Swedish ship to Puerto Barrios. Photographs of crates labeled in a foreign language raced across newspapers. In reality, the shipment was not vast, but in the Cold War climate, the optics were decisive. Washington declared the purchase proof of communist infiltration. For the CIA, it was a gift, a public justification, and a way to portray Árbenz as a puppet. Training camps in Honduras and Nicaragua filled with recruits, Guatemalan exiles, mercenaries, and adventurers. They learned small unit tactics, sabotage, and radio discipline from CIA advisors and foreign military instructors. Weapons flowed through covert channels, including rifles, machine guns, and explosives, while diplomats prepared the international stage to minimize objection. The Organization of American States would be kept off balance. Friendly presidents would look the other way. American ambassadors would reassure jittery elites that the United States sought stability and democracy, even as their colleagues in the shadows torqued the bolts of regime change. Then came June 1954. La Voz de la Liberación broadcast almost non-stop, weaving a narrative of a rising army of patriots. It announced that Castillo Árbenz had entered Guatemala with thousands of men. In truth, his force was a fraction of that size. But radio collapses distance. Officers listening in their barracks couldn't see the border. They heard a nation marching. Aerial raids struck several targets. While the material damage was limited, the psychological impact was large. Rumors cascaded of massive columns approaching the capital, of garrisons switching sides, of foreign pilots gathering in the skies. The government tried to fight the narrative war, but its communications were slow, its counter-propaganda wooden, and its alliance already fraying. Inside the presidential palace, Árbenz faced a dilemma that haunts leaders targeted by covert action. If he cracked down hard, mass arrests, press closures, executions, he would confirm the charge of authoritarianism and perhaps lose international support. If he stood back and relied on legality, he might be overwhelmed by a movement that cared little for legal niceties. He opted for caution and legality. He tolerated criticism. He hesitated to arm civilian militias widely, fearing civil war. He counted on the professionalism of the army. He misjudged their appetite for risk. The pivotal moments unfolded in barracks and living rooms, not on battlefields. A series of senior officers told Árbenz privately that they could not guarantee order if the bombing continued, and radio reports of defections multiplied. They worried the United States might escalate. They feared the army would be blamed for chaos. Some pressed the president to resign temporarily to allow a caretaker solution. The CIA didn't need to destroy the army, it simply needed to convince the army that someone else would. Meanwhile, Castillo Árbenz' small columns probed inland, sometimes repelled, sometimes slipping through, always magnified by rumor. On June 27, 1954, Jacobo Árbenz Guzman announced his resignation on national radio. He told Guatemalans that the United States had humiliated a small nation and sabotaged its attempt at independence. He hoped that leaving would avert bloodshed. He handed power to his defense minister, thinking perhaps a friendly general could negotiate a settlement. It was a miscalculation. Within days, a junta formed. Within weeks, Castillo Árbenz, coached and supported by the CIA, consolidated power. Operation PBSUCCESS had achieved its objective without a large battle. It had proven a different proposition entirely, that a modern government could be knocked down by careful pressure applied at the pressure points of perception. What followed in Guatemala was not a restoration of democracy, but a winding road into fear. Castillo Árbenz voided the land reform and returned expropriated properties. Unions were crushed. A committee compiled lists of alleged communists. Detentions and exiles multiplied. The CIA remained close, offering advice and funds while maintaining distance in public. In the years and decades after 1954, Guatemala descended into cycles of coups, countercups, and civil war. The country's indigenous Maya communities, long marginalized, bore horrific violence at the hands of security forces and allied paramilitaries. While the causal chain from PBSUCCESS to every later atrocity is not simple or singular, the coup broke Guatemala's democratic trajectory and empowered forces that ruled through terror. Why did this operation work? Several elements combined. First, structural power favored intervention. United Fruit and its allies commanded influence in Washington and set the narrative early. Second, Cold War framing erased nuance. A nationalist land reform became Soviet beachhead. Third, the CIA understood that perception is a battlefield. Radios, rumors, and small demonstrations of force can shatter confidence in a government more efficiently than a division of soldiers. Fourth, the target's institutional center, the army, was predisposed to side with order over reform. Once officers doubted Árbenz's survival, his legitimacy evaporated. But success on its own terms carries costs. Consider the diplomatic fallout. Across Latin America, the coup taught a grim lesson. Reforms that threatened foreign corporate interests could trigger covert punishment. Leaders who watched what happened in Guatemala learned to preemptively repress leftists or cultivate Washington's favor, or risk becoming the next target. The United States, meanwhile, paid in credibility. For years, Washington insisted it championed democracy against totalitarianism. By mid-century, Latin Americans could point to Guatemala and reply, democracy, unless it touches a banana plantation. The informational dimension of PBSUCCESS also left a legacy. The operation pioneered techniques that would echo through later decades: clandestine radio to simulate a national uprising, planted stories in foreign press, front groups to mask funding, and carefully staged military actions to create the impression of a tide turning. In post-war Europe, in Iran, in Congo, in Chile, and elsewhere, variations on this template appeared. The technologies evolved, from shortwave transmitters to television and then digital channels, but the underlying insight remained consistent. People move not only because of force, but because of what they believe others will do. Look more closely at the radio war, and you'll see a masterclass in narrative timing. La Voz de la Liberación did not simply blast propaganda. It paced its claims, small early victories that sounded credible, followed by reports of defections, then promises of imminent arrival. It laundered messages by attributing them to sources inside the capital. It adopted a tone of inevitability. That tone matters. In politics and war, inevitability can be a self-fulfilling prophecy. An officer who believes a regime will fall tomorrow does not want to be the last person defending it today. A merchant hearing that rebels control a highway raises prices and hoards goods, unintentionally amplifying instability. A colonel who suspects his counterpart has already contacted the other side makes his own call. Each small act confirms the broadcast. Then consider the choice of targets for aerial raids. Even limited bomb loads can influence psychology if they strike nerve centers. Fuel tanks burning near a city produce towering columns of smoke visible for miles. A single pass over a barracks rattles windows, making the soldiers inside feel exposed. A near miss on a government building that leaves a crater on an official lawn punctures the illusion of control. The material damage may be modest, the symbolic damage is immense. Combined with rumors of larger forces crossing the border, each strike becomes a trumpet announcing that the future has arrived. Critics of Árbenz sometimes argue that he invited intervention by purchasing Eastern Bloc weapons and tolerating communists in his coalition. Supporters counter that the weapons were necessary because the United States blocked legal purchases, and that communists represented a small, lawful party in a pluralist system. What's clear is that the United Fruit Company's grievances were central, and that many Guatemalans did support land reform. Thousands of peasants received small plots that offered a first step out of dependency. Dismantling the reform returned power to old patterns. In the countryside, anger simmered. Over the following decades, Marxist insurgencies gained strength in part because peaceful reform had been shut down. The state's answer was often indiscriminate repression. Between the late 1970s and early 1980s, some of the worst massacres in the hemisphere scarred Guatemala's highlands. Inside the United States, Operation PBSUCCESS remained largely hidden for years. The public heard vague references to communist plots thwarted abroad. Only later did congressional inquiries and declassified documents fill in the details, the budget lines for covert action, the telegrams coordinating cover stories, the internal memos assessing Guatemalan officers for recruitment potential. These records do not reveal a single puppet master directing every move, but a bureaucracy convinced of its righteousness and skill. The men who ran PBSUCCESS believed they were defending the hemisphere from totalitarian advance. They also believed that domestic social reform in a small Central American republic threatened U.S. security because it challenged corporate dominance and the architecture of regional influence. The coup also shaped the CIA itself. Success breeds confidence, confidence breeds ambition. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, covert operators sought to replicate the Guatemalan playbook in Cuba, with disastrous results at the Bay of Pigs. There, Havana's revolutionary government possessed deeper legitimacy, broader support among the armed forces, and a charismatic leader who excelled at counter-narrative. Radios and leaflets could not conjure mass defections. The contrast isn't just a matter of luck, it underscores that the political chemistry of each target matters. Guatemala in 1954 was a laboratory where certain reagents, elite fear, military conservatism, corporate lobbying, Cold War anxiety, combined to explosive effect. Back in Guatemala, long after Castillo Armenz's assassination in 1957 and the carousel of regimes that followed, the country tried to reckon with its past. A Truth Commission in the 1990s documented atrocities committed during the Civil War and concluded that acts of genocide had been perpetrated against indigenous populations. The report traced the roots of the conflict through 1954, identifying the coup as a decisive rupture that closed off democratic avenues and opened the door to militarized solutions. These findings were more than footnotes. They testified to how a single success in the Cold War ledger could translate into generations of loss on the ground. Today, when Guatemalans discuss land, democracy, and sovereignty, 1954 is never far away. The name Árbenz carries complex meanings. To some, a flawed leader who misread the power of his adversaries. To others, a patriot who tried to break a feudal past and paid the price. In murals, in whispered family histories, in the arrangement of property lines that still date back to old concessions, the coup shadows the present. For Americans, the story poses harder questions. If democracy is a universal principle, what does it mean to deliberately dismantle it when it threatens powerful interests? If anti-communism justified nearly any act in the 1950s, how do we assess those acts after the Cold War's end? One might argue that geopolitical competition has always been ruthless and that small states are pawns. Yet that very logic is what vibrant democracies claim to transcend. The architects of PBSUCCESS saw themselves as realists. But realism without humility forgets that people beyond strategy memos have lives, farms, children, and futures. The peasants who received their first title deeds under Decree 900 were not chess pieces. When the reform was reversed, many drifted back into debt peonage or joined resistance movements that promised justice by other means. When villages were later targeted as subversive, families fled into mountains or across borders. The costs were not abstract. There is a paradox at the heart of covert action. The more effective it is, the harder it is to defend openly. That's why PBSUCCESS lived in the shadows for so long, hinted at in memoirs, erased in official timelines, and dressed up as the spontaneous revolt of patriots. The truth, as with most statecraft, is less cinematic and more bureaucratic. Budget lines, training plans, coordination cables, lists of officers deemed approachable, and spreadsheets of air sorties and leaflet drops. The myth of a 1,000-man army becoming 10,000 by sheer momentum was a product of careful scripting. It worked because the target audience, Guatemala's officer corps, was primed to believe it could work. Even the choice of the codename matters if you're inclined to symbolism. PBSUCCESS sounds businesslike, almost bland. It suggests a project management folder more than a revolution. And perhaps that's fitting. The operation was less about the thunderclap of battle and more about the quiet tightening of screws in the right order: isolate, intimidate, induce, replace. By the time the thunder arrived, bombs echoing over the capital, the essential work had already been done in mines. What would it have taken for Árbenz to survive? Some historians argue he should have armed peasants early and massively, trading short-term instability for a chance to resist the coup. Others believe he needed to purge hostile officers and create a loyal corps. Still others say the international diplomatic game was the crucial front, courting Mexico and other neighbors to stiffen resistance, exposing United Fruit's lobbying more aggressively in U.S. media, and framing the land reform as classical liberalism instead of leftist revolution. All of these counsel boldness, but leaders are bounded by context. A president elected to strengthen the rule of law hesitates to abolish it when threatened. A reformer trying to avoid civil war may avoid steps that increase the risk of civil war. Meanwhile, a foreign intelligence agency specializes in exploiting precisely that restraint. Long after the guns went silent, the ideology of PBSUCCESS seeped into how some elites in the region thought about power, that the legitimate source of rule is not only votes, but the approval of men with guns and friends abroad, that reform is a prelude to chaos, that media can be engineered and reality will follow. Those lessons, once learned, don't stay confined to one decade. They echo in strategies to delegitimize opponents, in campaigns to paint social movements as foreign plots, in the outsourcing of political battles to PR firms, and in the subcontracting of national futures to external patrons. There is another way to read the story. It's the human way. Imagine a peasant family in the early 1950s receiving a small parcel of land. For the first time, the father believes his children might inherit something. The mother joins a cooperative that teaches how to rotate crops and access credit. A teenager learns to read in a union schoolhouse. The radio speaks of reform, dignity, and citizenship. 2 years later, soldiers arrive with orders to restore property lines. Papers are rescinded. The cooperative dissolves. The teenager, angry now, meets a recruiter who promises justice in the hills. A decade passes. The war grows. Another unit arrives, this time under a doctrine that sees villages as supply nodes for insurgents. The family's house burns. They run. Their story is not a memo in a file, but it begins in a folder labeled PBSUCCESS. And if you listen carefully in today's Guatemala, you still hear resonances of 1954 in every debate about mining concessions, in every fight over a communal river, in every march demanding justice for mass graves, in every courtroom where survivors testify about what happened to their villages. The coup is not only a political event to be tallied in Cold War scorecards, it is a hinge in the lived history of a people. So when someone asks, how did the CIA topple Guatemala's democracy, the technical answer is straightforward. They built an exile army, constructed a powerful radio narrative, conducted targeted air raids and sabotage, corroded the loyalty of key officers, and leveraged diplomatic pressure to isolate a government. But the fuller answer is more unsettling. They intervened in the story a small nation was trying to write for itself and replaced the ending. In the margins of that edit, a generation lost its chance to find out what the 1944 revolution might have become. History is not only the record of what happened, but the memory of what could have happened. Guatemala in 1954 sits precisely at that intersection. For a brief time, it looked like a modest land reform combined with democratic institutions might transform a deeply unequal society. That possibility threatened interests powerful enough to make it disappear. Operation PBSUCCESS was by its own metrics a success. Guatemala has been living with the consequences ever since. And perhaps that is the final lesson. Covert action wins quickly and returns slowly. It's easy to count a toppled government. It is harder to count the school that was never built because a reform was reversed, the harvest that failed because a road was never paved, the child who never learned to read because a cooperative closed, the trust between neighbors that dissolved beneath suspicion and fear. These are not items in an after-action report. They are the quiet taxes levied by victories in the shadows. If you want to measure Operation PBSUCCESS, don't only tally the planes in the broadcasts. Walk the highlands. Listen in the marketplaces. Read the names etched into memorials. Then you will hear how a handful of men in faraway offices drew a line through a small republic's future, and how that line still runs, faint but unbroken, across the lives of millions.